First off, I want to thank you all for coming. I'm quite surprised at how many showed up. I'm glad to see everyone here. My name is Jeffrey Harmon. I am the president of the Murrieta Valley Historical Society, and tonight we're going to take a walk among some of our pioneers. We kind of mixed it up a little bit. We're going to look at some of the old pioneers. We're going to look at some of the new people. We got several different time eras that we're going to be looking at tonight. When we were looking this over, people were like, well, why don't you do this person or why don't you do that person? The problem we face right now is that, you know, if we visit each person for 2 minutes at a time, in 40 minutes we've only visited about 20 people. So I know there's a lot of people to see here, a lot of people to talk about. We can't get to them all tonight. Hopefully we can get through this tour in about an hour, because in an hour it's going to be dark and we're not going to be able to see where we're going. So we might end up under the tombstones. We don't want to do that. All right. Okay, so give you a quick history here. This is just an abridged version. I can give a 45-minute lecture another time, but we'll do this really quick for you. In 1886, several Murrieta residents got together and purchased the 10 acres from the Temecula Land and Water Company for $1. Yay. Okay, and at the time, this area was in San Diego County, and that's where the deed was recorded. In 1913, the Murrieta Historical Society inquired about the cemetery's ownership. Most of the founders had died or had moved out of the area. They eventually found the deed located in San Diego, and the property was then deeded to the society by one of the last surviving members. In 1915, the Riverside County placed the cemetery in the society's hands and made them the caretakers of the cemetery. Then in 1938, May of 1938, the Murrieta Cemetery District was formed, and that's where we're at today now. It's now a cemetery district, and I remember recently they just added eastward, didn't they? New portion for out towards, well, I'm talking about the district. Oh. They went out, it's like almost out to French Valley now, so that way they can get more funding for the cemetery here. One of the trustees of the cemetery in 1938 was Amos Sykes, who is the grandfather of Calvin and Dudley Sykes here. And according to their family, Amos Sykes is the one that named this cemetery the Laurel Cemetery, and it's named after the mountain Laurel. And so, yes?
There was more than one Amos. No, never mind.
Okay.
I was thinking their dad
Was here as well.
Yeah.
One of the trustees, exactly. There have been 2 devastating fires that have affected the cemetery. In the 1930s, a fire swept across the cemetery and destroyed many of the wooden crosses along with the names and information on them. So those were gone. And then the second fire took place 30 years later. The cemetery records were stored at the Murrieta Methodist Church. In 1963, the church, along with the cemetery records, was destroyed by an arson fire. Okay, so the section that's right here along Ivy Street here, this is known as the old section, and you'll see there's a lot of gaps in there, a lot of missing headstones and crosses, and we can't bury anyone here because we have absolutely no idea who's here. The records are gone, the crosses are gone. Okay, the ones that they did know where they were buried, because family said this is where they're buried, we have brand new crosses here that was part of the Boy Scout project, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, tonight we're going to be walking the grounds. We're going to do a loop here. Please be respectful of the graves. We got a big group with us tonight, so just kind of watch where you're stepping. The ground is uneven at places. Again, we have about an hour of daylight. We will need to keep the questions to a minimal so that we can complete the tour. And I have book knowledge here, but there are those here in our group tonight that have living knowledge. We're going to be visiting people that they knew or related to because they have brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, all living here. So they might give us a little bit more information as we're going along. So I'll try to keep my stuff as a minimum so give them a chance to talk as well. Any questions before we get started? Am I talking loud enough so you can hear me? Okay, I'm using my classroom voice, so that's good. All right. All right, so we are going to get started into the old section here, and we'll be walking over to, so right here, this is the Buchanan family plot, and the Buchanans were one of the first families here in the town of Murrieta, and they were the builders of Murrieta. The patriarch was Daniel Buchanan. He is buried here in an unmarked grave. And he was a carpenter, so some of the first houses, the first stores, the first barns were built by Daniel Buchanan. And we are starting off with his son because we have a grave marker for him. And his son was David Buchanan. And David Buchanan was born in 1875 in Williamstown, Pennsylvania. He was 9 years old when the Buchanan family moved here to Murrieta. And he basically followed his father's footsteps and was also a carpenter. And he continued doing what his father did of building houses, barns, storefronts. And he also did a little bit of farming. His son is James Buchanan right here. David had married Maud Aubert, and Maud's parents were Swiss immigrants. And anything else on the Buchanans? Because this was one of our last editions. No? Okay. All right, so Buchanan. All right, we're going to take another walk over. All right, this section here is the Tarwater family plot here. The obelisk here is the second tallest obelisk that we have here. And we are right now looking at Benjamin Tarwater. Benjamin Tarwater's grave is unmarked, but we find it by finding the obelisk and then his son-in-law, Emil, and then Benjamin Tarwater is buried right in here. And I'll explain why there's not a grave marker there for him in just a moment. But Benjamin Tarwater was born in Cedar County, Missouri in 1848. His family moved from Missouri to Boonville, Mendocino County, California in 1852. He then came down to Los Angeles and was a constable in Downey. He then went into San Diego County and he worked at the Stonewall Gold Mine at Lake Cuyamaca. Thank you. A little tongue-tied. He married Nancy Kirkman on January 28, 1886, and they moved to Murrieta about 1890 and purchased the Ross Peffley House on Plum Avenue. So today, if you go to Plum Avenue, you'll see the Tarwater House, and the Tarwater House is there, and that's the house that the Tarwaters have lived in. In 1891, Benjamin Tarwater opened the Tarwater Cash Store near the intersection of B Street and First Avenue. Murrieta residents bought goods at the Tarwater store on credit. When the time came to settle the debts, customers either paid with cash or they paid with land. The southern lowlands of Murrieta became known as the Tarwater Flats because Benjamin owned many lots in that area. He was called Uncle Ben, and the Murrieta residents loved and respected him. He was elected Murrieta's constable in 1900 and served for at least 4 years. Benjamin and Nancy Tarwater had 5 children: Urban, Earl, Alda, Benny, and Paul. Their daughter Benny died 1 month shy of her 3rd birthday, and this obelisk has her name on it. Nancy died in 1905. Her name's on this one. And Benjamin never remarried. Benjamin's father, Robert, came down here to live with Benjamin the remainder years of his life, and he died at the Tarwater House in 1909, and his name's on the obelisk. So there's 3 Tarwater names on this obelisk. Paul, Benjamin's youngest son, died of typhoid fever in 1911. Benjamin Tarwater constructed a new cement block store at the corner of Washington Avenue and B Street. He rented out his first building. That building today is the Murrieta Country Market that you know on Washington. He died in 1939, and one of his requests when he died was he did not want any monuments or special honors bestowed upon his grave, so it was left unmarked. Benjamin's children were not interested in operating the Tarwater store, and the store closed immediately following his death. So, Benjamin Tarwater. All right, any questions? Cemetery tour needs at least one strange story, or else you don't have a good cemetery tour. So we have to have one good strange story. And this one is this case of the headless body buried at the cemetery. All right, so this is the Defani family, and Miss Wilhelmina Defani lived with her two sons in Murrieta while her husband Andrew was back east in Missouri. In July 1889, her son George Defani, he was 22, returned to his home in Murrieta after spending some time visiting the California coast. He found his mother deathly ill and took off into the night to Wildemar to find the country doctor. The doctor quickly raced to Murrieta, but George did not follow him. The doctor brought comfort as best as he could to Miss Wilhelmina Defani, but it was too late, and she died on July 31st, 1889. When daylight broke, people began looking for George Defani, but could not find him. Search parties went out, but he was gone. 6 months later, in December, a rancher went into Decker Canyon and found a decomposed body hanging on a tree. The head, the bones in the hands, and the bones in the feet were all missing. One finger remained with a ring on it. A scribbled suicide note was found in the clothing. The body was identified as George Defani. He had blamed himself for his mother's death because he did not stay and take care of her. The scattered bones and clothing were gathered up and put into a box and buried in the cemetery. There was no religious service performed. So we have a headless body here. Get a history. There's one name that always comes up, especially when it comes to photographs, and it's the photo collection of Emma Hale Kern. And out of the countless number of people that I have researched, she's the one that's the most fascinating to me because she was born in 1900 and died in 1999, which means that she saw a full century of history. I mean, when you think about it, she saw the first airplane fly over Murrieta. 30 years later, she took, was it 30 years? 50 years. 50 years later, she actually took her first flight over Murrieta. So, Emma Hale Sykes was born April 11th, 1900 in Murrieta, California. Her mother, who is listed as Babe over here, died 1 week later of blood poisoning. Her father, Harvey Sykes, was a railroad man. Hale Sykes was raised by her aunt, Miss Katie E. Sleeper, which is right here, and lived at the Fountain House Hotel. At the age of 21, Hale's aunt died and she inherited the Fountain House. She rented the hotel and moved to Los Angeles. She married Richard Kern and they had 2 children. The Kern family moved back to Murrieta in 1930 and lived in the Fountain House. Dick and Hale divorced, and Hale continued to raise her children alone in the hotel. In October 1935, the hotel caught fire and burnt to the ground. The Murrieta residents raised funds and rebuilt a home for Hale and her 2 children. To support her family, Hale walked to the Murrieta Hot Springs Resort each day to work. When Rose Tarwater was appointed postmistress, Hale Kern was hired to be Rose's assistant, and she no longer had to walk to the hot springs. She worked at the post office for 35 years. She is remembered for her passion to preserve Murrieta's history. She collected and took photos of Murrieta and the residents. Her collection provides a glimpse of the early life of Murrieta. She died on June 28, 1999 at the age of 99. She has lived and witnessed the entire 20th century. There have been 17 presidents, 2 world wars, Depression. She saw the first plane fly over Murrieta, and she witnessed on television man landing on the moon. The E. Hale Kern Elementary School is named in her honor for her services in Murrieta. All right.
There's some of her pictures that go in the new museum.
All right. This is our tallest obelisk here in the cemetery, and quite fitting, this is the only founder of the cemetery to be buried here. This is Abram B Burnett, who was born in 1839 in New York State. He was the son of Franklin and Mary Ann Burnett. As a young man, Abram began to work for the railroad and lived in Rutland, Vermont. When the Civil War broke out, Abram enlisted as a private in Vermont's Company K of the 12th Infantry. He served from August 24th, 1862 to July 14th, 1863. His regiment served in and around Washington, D.C. during that time to protect the Union capital. Burnett and his company were marching toward the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, but were diverted and sent to protect ammunition trains. After the war, Abram moved to Vidalia, Illinois, and on May 5th, 1874, he married Rachel Mirren Davis. Rachel was the daughter of Daniel and Mary Scott Davis. And this obelisk has two names on it. One is Abram Burnett, and his mother-in-law is also listed on here. And she was one of the earliest burials in the cemetery. So it's very fitting that he was one of the founders of the cemetery to provide a final resting place for his mother-in-law. He built a house on the corner of Washington Avenue and Juniper Street. His home is the second oldest surviving home in the historic Murrieta Township. Today we call it the Lakeman House. He also established a lumber dealership and helped provide lumber for the growing town. He established the Murrieta Historical Society in May 1885. The Historical Society was founded for recording the daily happenings of the new colony and recording the daily weather, not like the Historical Society today. He was a founder of the Murrieta Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a supporter of the Murrieta Grammar School, and he was one of the founders of the cemetery. Abram and Rachel had no children. He died on their 25th wedding anniversary in Los Angeles. Afterwards, Rachel moved to Los Angeles and lived to the age of 94. However, her final resting place is currently unknown. Abram Burnett served his country and he served his community, and he should always be remembered. And we are now looking at one of our newer pioneers, so to speak, for Murrieta. This is John McElroy. John was born in Tower Hill, Illinois in 1922. As a young boy, moved with his family to Alberta, Canada. When he was a teenager, the family returned to the United States, and after serving in the Air Corps, he relocated in Los Angeles, where he opened an auto body shop. He married Stephanie Hampson, a young actress who was working for Howard Hughes at RKO Studios. John and Stephanie had 3 children. John became a builder and a land developer. While living in Burbank, he built houses in Van Nuys and the surrounding area. In Anaheim, he built the first industrial subdivision. He moved to Corona in 1962, where he developed the Mountain View Golf Course. In the mid-60s, John and his brother Lynn purchased a 1 million-acre ranch in Brazil, north of its capital. They later donated the ranch to the American Boy Scouts. In 1968, John purchased acreage here in Murrieta and began farming, growing oats, wheat, and barley. In 1988, he was at the Windmill Restaurant on the corner of Jefferson Avenue and Ivy Street in Murrieta. He was having breakfast with Tex McAllister, George Walker, and they were discussing the issue at hand. That issue was that Temecula was going to become a city, and Temecula was going to include Murrieta. And they were like, that's not going to happen. We are not going to be Temecula. So each one of them contributed $5,000 each to begin the drive for Murrieta cityhood. He was named the president of the Cityhood Drive, and in 1989 he was named Murrieta Citizen of the Year. So thanks to his efforts, we do not stand in the city of Temecula. We stand in the city of Murrieta. McElroy shared his love of flying with his friends, sometimes taking them to faraway places. He claimed to have owned more than 130 aircraft in his lifetime. He rubbed elbows with movie stars and met his heroes, Charles Lindbergh and Howard Hughes, with whom he shared a love of flying. McElroy was always helping people who needed a hand. Every time he needed something, he was there, and he never took payment for his help. He died at the age of 82 in Orange County after fighting a 5-year battle with Alzheimer's. But he is one of our founding fathers of the city of Murrieta. Thank goodness. So, yes, that's why. Terry, one of the things that we always want to make sure we do is honor our first responders, and especially our fire department, because it plays a really big part in Murrieta's history. And we are here at Matthew Paul Mohr's gravesite. He was born September 13th, 1964. He came from a long line of family firefighters. His dad, uncle, and brother were all firefighters. He graduated from Los Amigos High School in 1983. High school sweethearts Matt and Sherry met in 1982 and were married on September 8th, 1990. They had 3 children. He was a 20-year veteran of the fire service. He received an associate's degree in fire science from Santa Ana College and graduated from the Santa Ana Fire Academy in September of 1986. He worked as a reserve firefighter for the Santa Ana, Corona, and Murrieta fire departments before being hired by Murrieta Fire Protection District as a full-time firefighter in October 1990. An excellent firefighter, Matt quickly rose through the ranks and was promoted to captain in May 2001. His passion was mentoring young kids in the Fire Explorer and Reserves program. In November 2007, Matt developed flu-like symptoms, which were eventually diagnosed as Wallamathia mandrilis amoebic meningitis.
Oh, no.
Try to say that a couple times. It is presumed that he contracted this illness while working in high winds, protecting the city of Murrieta from the threat of wildfires. So it would have been something that was blowing in the wind, and he got the respiratory complications. Matt passed away on March 10, 2008 after several surgeries and complications. He fought this illness with every last breath. He was just 43 years old. He was a Christian man who loved spending time with his family and his friends. He was a responsible adult, but he was like a big kid. His sense of humor and loving spirit made it a joy to spend time with him. He was gracious and kind, often mentoring young men and helping them achieve their dream of becoming professional firefighters. Matt loved the outdoors, enjoyed backpacking and fishing with his friends and family.
Definitely could tell he was a fisherman.
Yeah, Matt was the
That's a fish
Murrieta
jumping
Fire
out.
Department's second line of duty dip.
Here in Murrieta, that would be the Garrison family, and very, very strong pillars in our society, in our community. Volunteered a lot for us, and their daughter's here. Victor Garrison was the owner and operator of the Murrieta Machine Shop for 37 years. It is located on the corner of Washington Avenue and C Street. In 1947, he donated a piece of his land behind the machine shop to be used as the site of Murrieta's first fire station. He was named the first assistant fire chief in the newly formed Murrieta Volunteer Fire Department. He was also the president of the newly formed Murrieta Valley Town Hall Association when it formed in 1956. He was past president and director of the Murrieta Chamber of Commerce, and he was president of the Murrieta Flying Club Association, and he was the director of the County Water District. So as you can see, they're very, very involved in our community. And let's see, he had married Arlene, and let's see, I'm sorry, go to Arlene here. See? They married in Easter Sunday, 1940. Is that right? 39. Thank you. Yep, 1939. There it is. All right, so 1939, they were married. Arlene was an avid writer. She wrote many articles that appeared in the local newspapers. I read her stuff almost daily. She wrote the book My Children's Home, which was the first book published about the history of Murrieta. She was commander of the Ground Observation Corps in the 1950s. The GOC operated with volunteers at the Murrieta Fire Station, watching the skies for enemy planes. She was president of the Murrieta Chamber of Commerce. She was a founding member of the Murrieta Garden Club, which is still active today, and I believe one of the longest active civic groups we have right now. She was a founding member of the Citizens of Historic Murrieta. That was a historic group that had formed when we became a city. They were concerned that when we became a city that we would lose a lot of our historic sites as a city, and so they had formed to protect what we had here. One of the big things that their group was able to protect was the 10-acre site where the burned out grammar school is, where the train depot used to be. Believe it or not, that sacred site was going to be a huge track system, and they stopped it. So we're very, very grateful, because that is now going to be what we call Pioneer Park, if we ever get the money for it. And she was also a member of the Murrieta Historic Commission, which is what we had for a number of years here in Murrieta. So again, two wonderful, wonderful people that helped preserve Murrieta's history and helped it grow. Any comments about your parents?
It's a hard act to follow, you know. They were busy all the time.
They set the bar pretty high, didn't they? Yes. All right, we'll take a walk. First off, we are right now at Patrick Saminego's. Did I say the name right? Okay. It's not Saminego. Did I say it right? Wrong. Almost.
Close.
Okay. There are two Patricks. One is an uncle, one's a nephew. The nephew was a cowboy. This one we're looking at is the uncle. So I always have to make sure everyone knows who I'm talking about. He was the son of Victor Saminego, who was a Mexican who moved to California before 1877. Victor married Rosinda Carrillo, a California native, and has settled in Paula. Patrick only obtained about a 4th grade education. On June 5th, 1917, Patrick, at the age of 29, filed his draft card at the Murrieta Register's office. He received his training at Camp Lewis, Washington, beginning in September of 1917. This was World War I, 100 years ago. He was assigned to the 91st Division, 364th Infantry, Company M. The Moose Argonne Offensive began 100 years ago on September 26, 1918. During the campaign, he was hit by German shrapnel in the right arm. He received medical treatment and was returned to the United States on December 26, 1918. He was then honorably discharged on January 30th, 1919. Because he had received an injury from enemy, he was awarded a Purple Heart. So this is one of our Purple Heart recipients. He married Lola Juarez from Satcoy, California on August 11th, 1931. They had 3 children, Ramona, Jack, and Leo. As he reached retirement age, he worked as a caretaker for this cemetery in Murrieta. And one of the stories he told his son, he would point somewhere in the old section, and he goes, up there was the last horse thief that was hung or killed. Where that grave is, who the person was, I don't know. But that was one of his favorite stories to tell as he was here taking care of the cemetery. His 2 sons followed in their father's footsteps. Jack served in the U.S. Army during peacetime operations in the 1950s, and Leo served in the U.S. Army and did 2 tours in Vietnam during their military service. They both spent time at Fort Lewis, Washington, where their father had trained during World War I. And they didn't know it until after that Murrieta has had a lot of military personnel that have lived here at one time or another, have served our country, and we've had them. We had one that went all the way back to was a Mexican-American War veteran that was here at one time. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, if we had so many people that were in the military, did we lose any of ours while they were in service? And we are visiting David Young, and he's one of our Murrieta boys that we lost in military service. He was born in Los Angeles in 1922 and was well known in throughout this community. He attended Murrieta Grammar School and later graduated from Elsinore Union High School, where he was an outstanding in football. After graduating from school, Young went into the cadet training program and had been in the service of his country for 7 years. Lieutenant Young was born in Murrieta after leaving the United States on April 1st, 1948, Lieutenant Young was a jet fighter pilot, and he served in Korea for 18 months before being transferred to Japan. And he was in Japan, and on February 22nd, while in Japan, there was an airplane accident, and he died. And he was scheduled to come back to the States just 2 months later in April. And Calvin and Dudley were sharing right before the tour began that he had requested that when he came back that he would have a car waiting for him. And they had purchased a brand new car for him, waiting for him to come home. And sadly, he didn't come home the way they thought he would come home. So we want to thank him for his service, but he's one of ours that we lost in military service. Okay. We are here at Raymond Thompson's grave. He was the son of Melville and Blanche Thompson. He was Murrieta's first fire chief. When the Murrieta Volunteer Fire Department was formed in 1947, Raymond Thompson was working for Camp Pendleton Fire Department. With his experience and expertise, Raymond Thompson trained the volunteer firefighters and worked to purchase Murrieta's first fire truck. A fire station was built that same year on the Garrison Place behind the Murrieta Machine Shop on C Street. The first annual Fireman's Barbecue occurred in April 1948 to celebrate the completion of the fire station and the founding of the fire department. After serving 27 years, Raymond Thompson resigned and moved to Fallbrook, California. Marvin Kern, son of Hale Kern, who we had visited earlier, was promoted to fire chief to replace Thompson. Anyone have any more stories about Ray Thompson?
Yeah, one of the things that Raymond did was he kind of helped out here at the cemetery from time to time, and the ground was frozen one year. So he decided, well, that's easy. We'll just use dynamite. I think Donna's the one that told me that story, so she knows more than I do.
You writing an article for the press?
Yeah.
Good. I'll look for it. So one of the questions people ask about the cemetery is, do we have anyone famous buried here? And we have a famous artist that's buried here, one that I've never heard of, so I don't know how famous he is. But he was definitely renowned in the art world. His name was John Searle. His birth name was Jerry Palmer. And he was a self-taught artist. He became nationally recognized as a significant folk and primitive artist, and he had died at the age of 98 in Elsinore at his studio home and was buried here in Murrieta. John Searle, that's his real name, there, on an Indian reservation in upstate. He was born on an Indian reservation upstate New York, and he eschewed school and performed with his vaudevillain family as a singer, dancer, and a female impersonator. Moving to Denver, New York, and eventually Hollywood, he worked as an actor, dancer, waiter, cherry picker, screenwriter, and voice dubber for silent screen stars who could not make the switch to talkies. He used the names Slats, Ned Palmer, Jerry Palmer, and finally John Searle. He married and divorced 3 times and fathered 2 children, but remained an unrestricted loner who frequently noted, "Monogamy bores me." "I don't want any family, and I've never had one," he told the Times in 1988, adding that his paintings served as both his children and his friends. In the later half of his life, he painted more than 1,200 works, using scavenged scraps of wood, masonite, plywood signs, and canvas, and mixing his own pigments from the earth and the plants he grew. He began painting in 1949 when he moved into a San Juan Capistrano adobe older than the nearby Mission, and decided a blank wall needed a painting on it and didn't have the 50 cents to buy the cheapest one he found. For a couple of decades, he refused to sell or exhibit any of his paintings, but as he grew older, he became concerned with preserving his work for future generations. In 1970, he permitted the Municipal Arts Department of Los Angeles to organize a touring display of 41 paintings, and he slowly started selling to schools and eventually through galleries. In 1990, the New York Times reviewed Searle's work as complex and sophisticated in both meaning and style, and described his images as cartoonishly buoyant, yet emotionally weighted, spiritual, yet worldly, and sexually aware. "I have a way of painting that is mine," Searle once told the Los Angeles Times. "People can see it in it whatever they want. They either like it or they hate it." Whitney Museum curator Susan Larson told the Times in 1989, "John has a highly sophisticated mind and an extraordinarily broad perception of reality. He never takes anything at face value and always searching for the deeper reality of things. His work encompasses everything from small town parades to mystical interpretations of after-death experiences. But the theme that seems to color all his work is the intermingling of the spiritual and the physical." In 1971, he moved to Lake Elsinore because the bird watching was better. "I don't know why I've lived so long," he told the Times in 1989. "I'm tired and I'm not glad to be alive because it's very hard. I like to be free, and if it weren't for my paintings, I probably would have died long ago." So there you go, one of our famous artists that is buried here.
How do you spell his last name?
Searl. Her famous burials here in the Laurel Cemetery is Douglas Vincent Folly. He was born in the Bronx, New York City, and moved to Los Angeles and studied at Los Angeles City College. He served in the Navy in the South Pacific in World War II and lost all of his own teeth in an explosion aboard the aircraft carrier during battle. The fact he had false teeth was used in the movie Battleground in 1949, with his character Private Kipton sometimes clicking his false teeth after speaking for effect and later losing them temporarily in an attempt to get off the front line. He appeared more than 200 films from his debut in The Mad Game of 1933 with Spencer Tracy and Claire Trevor, but he's fondly remembered for his role in the classic 1952 musical Singing in the Rain, where he played a film director trying to ease a silent film star into her first talking picture. In television, he's remembered for his role as Doc Holliday in the popular ABC Western series The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp during the 1950s and early 60s. He also appeared in several TV series. He died at the Motion Picture and Television Country House and Hospital shortly before his 87th birthday. And most people ask, how in the world did he end up out here? And what I have found so far is his wife, Jean, had lived in Murrieta at one time and probably had purchased the plots, and they were living in Woodland Hills at the time that he had passed away and brought him back here. So that's how he ended up out here. His last film was the North Avenue Irregulars, 1979, produced by Disney. Again, we always love to honor our military, and this is one of our special Murrieta boys who served not in just one war, but in 2 wars. Eugene Small was born August 18th, 1897 at the family home near the Tenaha Road in Murrieta, California. He was the son of A.K. Small and Edith Thompson Small. He was one of 5 children. When President Woodrow Wilson had declared war on Germany in April of 1917, 1 week later, Eugene Small was at the recruiter's office. He was the first Murrieta boy out the gate. He didn't want to wait for the draft. And he signed up with the Navy. He was assigned to the USS Frederick. The ship was part of the cruiser force, Squadron 1, Division 2. It served as the convoy escort group's flagship during all of 1917 and 1918. The convoy escorted ships ferrying troops across the Atlantic to Europe. German submarines were patrolling the waters, and Eugene's crew was ready to defend their American troops. During a storm at sea in early 1918, Eugene was on deck when a wave crashed over the deck. He could have been washed overboard, but he hit the railing instead and was saved from drowning in the ocean. However, when he hit the deck, it tore him all up from the waist down. And the ship doctor did not think he would survive for them to get to the mainland. But he did. And he went through a couple of surgeries. And then once he was stabilized, he was sent to San Diego and had another surgery. His niece has shared the ship made a sudden evasive maneuver that caught the deck watch off guard. Gene was nearly swept overboard, but was flung against the railing that saved his life. He suffered severe internal injuries from the impact, and he was not expected to live. When World War II began, Eugene again decided to enlist, this time with the Army. He had no wife or children, so there was nothing to lose. He was assigned as a training officer in Texas and served for 3 years. And then when he reached, I think it was the age 44, 45, what is it? He was honorably discharged. And he was more than happy to leave Texas and come back home. Eugene married Hazel Irene Johnson on October 4th, 1968, during a surprise double ring ceremony in Riverside, California. They had no children. He died a few months later in his childhood home. And today we honor the memory of Eugene Small for his selfless sacrifice to serve our country not once, but twice. Though he never stood on a battlefield, he took to his post and performed his duties admirably. Thank you for your service. Eunice Kane and her daughter Connie is here to share a little bit about Eunice. Are you going to be able to do this?
Yes.
Okay.
My mother was born Eunice Emily Specht, January 31st in 1910 in Chicago, Illinois. And they lived there for quite a few years. She went to Northwestern University. And when the family moved out here to California, she also went to USC. I'm not positive. I think that's where she met my father. And I'm not as organized as Jeffrey is. I'm just going to tell you a few stories. She wasn't one of the pioneers out here. She lived here in Murrieta from 1952 and passed away in 1973. But she was very influential, and she was very respected and cared for. And I said to Jeffrey in a meeting, I said, "Why'd you choose my mom?" And Mary, who was also in our meeting, she said, "Well, everybody loved her. She was a teacher, and how many of you guys were in her classes?" So, so she taught school almost all those years that she was out here, and she retired, I think, in 1967, and then my father passed away, and so then she went back to work. And she taught until she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was diagnosed with cancer between Christmas and New Year's in the end of 72. And I had a 2-year-old at that time, and there was not much they could do for my mom, but she had to go into Riverside for radiation treatments. And so all the women of Murrieta decided that I wasn't supposed to be driving my mother every day because I had a 2-year-old, but they all took turns, and that way they all had time alone with her, and that she could visit with them and they could visit with her. And my brother told me a story today that I didn't really know, and he said that he always remembers this story, and maybe we can check this out. She was one of the last teachers, and it probably was substitute teaching, or maybe she had a short stint teaching in the one-room schoolhouse in Winchester before it was torn down. She taught in the 4-room schoolhouse here in Murrieta, and she taught in the new school on Adams Street. So she really was influential in town. She was involved in 4-H, and she was involved in PTA, PTC, I think they called it then. And my dad always said about her, he said, when your mother's teaching, she's glassy-eyed. And she really was. I mean, she just loved the kids and loved teaching them. And it always makes me feel so good inside when I'll have people like Pat, or a lot of people will come up and say, gee, I really loved your mom. She was my best teacher, and I really appreciated her. So that's why we're stopping at her grave today.
Yeah, I have something too. I was in the first kindergarten class in Murrieta, and she was my teacher in '62, I think. And she was also my teacher when John Kennedy was assassinated. And we were all in line, and she had us all pray. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Wow.
Thank you.
Excuse me?
Oh, no.
Have these stones so close to the trees?
Well, when they
Yeah,
were
it's like-
buried, there wasn't any trees there.
Is that what happened?
Yeah, you can see the tree like almost started growing over this one here, and that one taken over there. All right, John Farthing. John Farthing was Murrieta's early African American settler here. He was born in Tennessee on May 15, 1865. He had settled in Riverside County by 1909. He made a living as a day laborer and as a fertilizer dealer. In November 1912, he had purchased 20 acres in Murrieta from Charles Clogston on the southeast corner of Jefferson Avenue and Ivy Street. His wife was Selena, who was born about 1870 in Indiana. She had family in Chicago and traveled back east often to visit. She may have been married previously. John and Selena had settled in Elsinore. In 1917, John worked for 6 months in Imperial Valley. In 1918, he moved to Murrieta and bought a team of horses and a cow. John continued to earn a living shipping carloads of fertilizer by railroad. In August 1923, John opened a new service station with a lunch counter in Murrieta. Selena was the cook. Their small restaurant specialized in chicken dinners. 3 years after John Farthing opened his service station, Mr. and Miss Ralph Bates opened a service station and diner in August of 1926. The new station was on the opposite corner of the Farthing station. Pa and Ma Bates became a favorite hangout for local teens and a famous stop along the Inland Highway. Research suggests that the Bates put the Farthings out of business. Miss Farthing moved to Los Angeles by 1931, and no further information about her has been found. It is unknown if she died up there or if their marriage had dissolved. But John Farthing continued to live in Murrieta. Toward the end of his life, he had received permission from Hale Kern to move his small dwelling onto her property. When she returned after a day's work, she came home and found out that he had set up his house on her front lawn. She expected him to put it in the backyard and put it in the front yard. John Farthing died on November 11th, 1945 at the Arlington Hospital and was laid to rest in the Laurel Cemetery. And the records show that E. Hale Kern purchased his grave marker. He is often referred to as Murrieta's only African-American resident for many years. So,
Did you say he died in 1911?
1945,
Oh, I thought I heard you say
November 11th.
Oh, November.
How do we say it?
Elohim.
Elohio?
Yeah.
Elohio Sotelo? Elohio Sotelo. And this is Annette's grandparents?
Yeah, Robert.
Robert and, yep, there's Robert. Robert and Annette's grandparents. He was born in Mexico and came to California in 1922. His wife, Jessie, and their daughter, Mary, arrived in 1925. They had 4 children, May, Alfred, Alice, and Arthur. He was a miner in the local silica mines. His labor resulted in him contracting, how do we say?
Silicosis.
Silicosis, thank you, which caused his death. To support the family during his long illness, Jessie worked as a seamstress in Lake Elsinore. The children also worked. Fred started at the age of 10 baling hay and doing other farm work. Mary and Alice worked in King's Cafe on the corner of Ivy and Jefferson Avenue as teenagers, where they served a number of famous Hollywood movie stars who were staying at the Murrieta Hot Springs Resort. And of course, my favorite one is when Alice talks about when she was working in the back and they said, come up front, we want you to serve a sandwich to someone. And she went up to the front counter and she served a hamburger to John Wayne.
Oh my.
So he was here.
He owned a ranch in Temecula, or actually Sage.
Sage?
Yeah, the ranch is still there.
Is it?
Yeah.
Didn't
I
I
used
know
to be able to go horseback right in there years ago. You could rent horses and stuff.
Thank you for sharing that. The family also worked their farm raising chickens and rabbits, which they sold to the markets in Lake Elsinore and Los Angeles. Anything else that I missed? Okay. I was going to show you one more grave, but there's a hose in the way and I don't want to get it. But believe it or not, right behind this niche here, up against the fence line, there is a grave back there for Ernest Lakeman. And so we won't go back there, but it's back behind the wall there. He was born in Germany and immigrated to the United States when he was 15 years old. He married Mary Luden, a widow in Los Angeles in 1904. He purchased the former Burnett home at the corner of Washington Avenue and Juniper Street. He found work at the Murrieta Hot Springs and began a small fruit stand on his property. When business increased at his fruit stand, he built an ice cream parlor and a confectionery store on his property. In 1917, he rebuilt his store and renamed it the Lakeman Lunchroom. In December 1924, he sold the lunchroom to Henry Eiler, also a German immigrant. Ernest moved to Los Angeles and operated another diner. In 1934, he retired from the restaurant business and moved back to Murrieta to live with his stepson's family, James Witcher. He built a home on the Witcher property and then died later that year. And the Lakeman Lunchroom is what we know today as Ray's Cafe.
Oh,
So he was one of them. But again, his grave is behind the niche, down the thing, against the fence. There's a hose in the way right now. I don't want anyone to trip over there. Thank you so much for coming out. We have people here that know more than I do. This is book knowledge. You have living history among you right now that can tell you more stories. And I appreciate it. Any one question?
This Sotelo and that Sotelo, this one has two L's. Are they family?
Same family. Yeah, different spelling.
You don't know how to spell or somebody made a mistake.
Well, anytime you try to spell Sotelo, you get two people spell it different. So.
Thank you so much for coming